Hello, everyone. Thank you for checking out this special episode of Really Dicey. This is Manny, and I am here with.
My name's Christopher Colston, and I'm a senior producer at Cubicle 7.
And today we're going to talk about Ubersreik Adventures, the third book in a series of adventures based on that setting for Warhammer Fantasy role playing. Christopher, thank you for taking the time to talk to us. But first things first, why don't you tell us, share with us a little bit of background for anyone that's not familiar with your work with Cubicle 7?
Yeah, certainly, Manny. I have originally started as a producer at Cubicle 7, working on the Warhammer lines themselves. So I worked with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and Wrath and Glory primarily at first, and recently I've obviously worked on things like IM and some of the more recent Warhammer Fantasy productions, like the Dwarf Player's Guide. But prior to being at Cubicle 7, my love of Warhammer stretches back right into my early teens when I first started playing the tabletop game and sort of fell into the role-playing games thereafter.
I am very glad to talk to you today because Ubersreik and the world of Warhammer Fantasy has intrigued me for a long time. It's one of those games that I try to find groups to play with at conventions when I can. A few years ago, we did an unboxing of the Warhammer Fantasy starter set for 4th edition, and I was impressed with the artwork. I loved the world that was presented. Let's talk about the setting a little bit. How would you describe Ubersreik?
Ubersreik is a town within the boundaries of the Reichland and the Empire. It is the principal setting for many of the Warhammer adventures that we have published, including, as you mentioned, the starter set and the 3 follow-up adventure books, which all take place in or around or in the duchy or in and around the city of Ubersreik. For us, it's a really nice sort of counterpoint with Warhammer Fantasy. The big go-to campaign is obviously The Enemy Within, which takes you right across the Empire. So with Ubersreik being this sort of large city that we use as the base of operations, and it allows us to sort of delve in deeper into life in a town, etc., gives us opportunity to explore all of the things that make Warhammer Warhammer. And go sort of above the just looking at the grim dark and actually building out a whole town where, not only do your characters have adventures, but they also develop and become, your characters in a much more sort of detailed setting, which I think always lends a great deal of credibility to the roleplay experience itself, as if the setting is well-rounded, it's incredibly fleshed out, and it has attention to detail. Which is what we've hoped to sort of do with Ubersreik overall.
Would you say this is a very dangerous world?
I like to think so, but I also like the explanation that it does still bring in sort of like more new school sort of like thinking, and that like no one wants to go back to the days of I've killed my character by failing to roll to get on a horse outside of combat or roll. Like it's not, those things are great and mechanically they have a place in time, but we are at a point now where we want to capture that grimdark element. We want to present it for your experiences, the stories that you're telling with yourselves at the table, but the mechanical aspect of it just being punishing, we've tried to move away from. But whilst keeping a level of detail that keeps people who are attracted to the system or the rule set of that system happy as well.
This is sort of revolves around the really popular Enemy Within campaign for Warhammer, which one day I gotta sink my teeth into. Everyone keeps telling me it's a fantastic long-term campaign. But how did the ideas for the Ubersreik adventures come to be?
Ubersreik Adventures 3, in particular, actually revisits a number of scenarios that have been published in previous editions of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And very much like you said in your previous question, they are updated to incorporate the sort of more modern ways of thinking or modern approaches to tabletop games, but whilst retaining all of those sort of Warhammer elements. In previous editions or the previous adventure books, So again, a mixture of sort of like revised and updated content and fresh stuff. And again, it's the how do we come up with them is very much part of like the design process. And when we're talking about the type of adventures we want people to have in Warhammer Fantasy and in the towns that we've built out, and what we think is exciting for players and what we think people want to do at the table. And also, what's challenging, what's rewarding, that type of thing. And that's the type of detail that like I like to focus on when we're crafting out these adventures.
Let's talk about the book. So this book has an introduction that kind of explains a little bit more about the setting and the time period. But the other 4 chapters are 4 adventures, separate adventures. They probably can link together if you wanted to, but they can be played separately. Am I correct about that?
You're absolutely right there. Yeah, they are all capable of being sort of like chained together so that you would progress in your sort of travails around Ubersreik and then culminate with the Mirror of Desire taking place in the city itself. Or they could be entirely standalone adventures where you, as a party, visit these locations and get caught up in the events as they unfold. So with Ubersreik Adventures 3 and the previous volumes, what we've tried to do is make them as useful at the tabletop as possible. So the adventures can be chained together and form a small campaign where you travel around the Duchy of Ubersreik, with Mirror of Desire being the final adventure, sort of culminating in the city itself. Or if you've played through previous editions or you're from the starter set and are already familiar with Ubersreik, then they offer these sort of like great standalone sessions where you would travel outside and get caught up in these events as they unfolded.
Would you be able to give us a summary of each of the 4 adventures that are in this book?
I will certainly try my best, Manny, to do so with the minimum amount of spoilers. So an eye for an eye sees the characters leave the city of Ubersreik for a Grunwald Lodge, where they inadvertently get caught up in the machinations of the household staff, who are up to nefarious shenanigans, and I will say no further on that one. The second adventure in the book is called Mutiny and the Beast, and we'll see the players again sort of inadvertently caught up in the political intrigue of a small village and the power struggles that develop within it. And there are some orcs and goblins to throw into the mix there as well, just to complicate matters further. The Horror of Hugaldal is the third adventure in the book, and that one sees the players dispatched to a small mining town where a carnival arrives with the promise of some much needed respite and relaxation and all the fun of the carnival that it promises to bring. But as this is Warhammer, you can imagine that things do not unfold as intended. And the final adventure in the book is called Mirror of Desire, and would see the characters return to Ubersreik City. And possibly one of my favourite adventures for Warhammer Fantasy, because it is a brilliant mix of sort of like real like horror elements, but with a good sort of pinch of Monty Python-esque slapstick in the middle of it, which works as a great counterbalance.
So besides the 4 adventures, are there any I guess you could call them game master tools, things like new monsters or new items?
Yeah, so with the adventure books, we present them in a very GM-facing way. So the whole book is very much structured for the GM to utilize at the table, but we do include things like all of the stat blocks for NPCs, tables for events, and ways to sort of expand on the core content that's there. Additionally, there's plot hooks sort of interceded, or like sort of supplementary plot hooks throughout the book that allows a GM just to sort of to digress off onto a tangent if the players decide to go off a bit off kilter, and as well as that, the things like the actual enemies that are present in all the adventures have all of their stat blocks included in the core book as well.
If I may ask, this sort of deviates a little bit. Do you have any favorite particular NPCs in this book? Anything that stands out to you?
That is a fantastic question, Manny, because Ubersreik 3 sees the return of one of the most beloved and hated figures of Warhammer Fantasy's 4th edition, which is the Captain Rudy from the starter set. Who is one of my favourite recurring characters, mainly because of people's sort of real visceral reactions to him. They either love him or they hate him, but I got great pleasure in being able to bring him back into Ubersreik.
By the way, if you haven't picked up a physical copy of this book, viewers or listeners, I love the artwork for these books. I don't think you could really see it very well, but in the cover has a very glossy, has elements of glossiness at certain features, which really makes the book pop.
The cover art is by Sam Manley, who's been working with us for right through from the original publication of the core rulebook, and who'd done the previous Ubersreik Adventures covers as well. He's detailed the iconics in the center of the image from the starter set right through as well. So,
If I may ask, when it comes to the artwork for Warhammer Fantasy, what is the, I don't want to say the goal, but what is the feeling or what is the tone that you're hoping to capture with your artwork?
um, it's a really interesting question, Manny, because it does depend on what we're trying to depict in the art. There is a tendency to sort of gravitate towards this. Everything is very grim and dark and oppressive throughout the world of Warhammer, but there are areas of the world that are, sprawling green spaces. And if you think of like the Forest of Hate PDF, which is set in Athelloren, it has obviously a lot of wood elf art and stuff, which is very stylistically and tonally different to say the art of the dwarfs, which is very squared. So it really does depend on the situations that we're illustrating.
So one thing I really noticed that's great about this book, um, although there are stats here and there, but for the most part, this is a very story-driven book, meaning that it's not like a lot of stats and so forth. Was that done purposely so maybe that anyone that, let's say, want to take this into like Dungeons and Dragons could do so easily, or
Not intentionally, Manny, no, but it is. If it's a secondary sort of benefit from what we were intending, then that's fantastic. What I'm a big fan of is encouraging stories to sort of develop organically at the table, and I feel that a lot of the times that sort of hard mechanics and stat blocks and roll to XY hinder that. And what we're trying to do in some of the adventures is present them as much more sort of organic events that happen and that the players are sort of wrapped up in, and they unfold in a much more sort of organic fashion based on how people interact at the table and how they respond to the events, rather than very set, this happens and then this will happen if X. It's I am trying to break away from that sort of logic gate approach to story progression and let it develop in a much more organic fashion. Good thing about the collection of adventures in Ubersreik Adventures 3 is that they are all standalone, and whilst they are in the book set in and around Ubersreik, it would be a very minimal amount of work for a GM to sort of file the serial numbers off and set them in any location around the Empire. The only one that would be really is focused on being in Ubersreik is Mirror of Desire, because that features characters who are based in Ubersreik or who are in some way related to the larger stories unfolding in Ubersreik. But things like the events of Grunwald Lodge or the events in Hugaldal, they could theoretically take place anywhere in the Empire, with sort of minimum work from the GM to integrate them into their own campaigns.
now I'm not too familiar with Ubersreik, the setting just yet. Although I do plan to look more deeply into this world, but it feels like to me that feels like a little bit like Baldur's Gate to the upteenth level in adventure and threat level and so forth. Looks like there's a whole bunch of different like political and social intrigue going on as well as all the dangers around it. Would you say that that's what helps differs these adventures from maybe like other fantasy adventures, or is there more to that?
I think it's certainly one of the elements that helps Warhammer Fantasy stand on its own and separate from what we would probably class as sort of like more atypical fantasy. There is a huge amount of political intrigue and sort of the machinations of various different figures and their own plots and their own schemes unfolding simultaneously. And I suppose like one of the things that I suppose people are prone to overlook is that Warhammer Fantasies launched in 1986. There's nearly 40 years worth of lore pre-existing that is there and that helps it stand out because it is like 40 years worth of history and of detail and of background in these locations that help them stand on their own as well. So that would be one of the things, definitely, I'd say, yeah.
For anyone that's interested to learning more about Ubersreik and learning more about these adventures, is there other books? Is there other resources someone can look at to get more familiar with the setting?
To get more familiar with the setting, or as even just as an introduction to Warhammer Fantasy, the starter sets that Cubicle 7 produce are probably the best entry point. It gives you a selection of characters, it gives you a guide to Ubersreik as a setting, and it gives you an adventure to take people through step by step and a number of sort of handouts and stuff like that. It's all contained in a box. This sounds more like a sales pitch, but it is, from my point of view, a fantastic sort of entry point. And that's not just for Cubicle 7 as well. Like, I'm a big fan of starter sets in general, just because they allow people to dip their finger in the water, test, do I like the system, do I like the setting, before committing to, purchasing shelves loads of books.
Do you see more venture source books like these in the future dealing with the setting? Where do you see the line going?
Our most recent release was the Dwarf Player's Guide, and we're looking to follow that up with an additional book on dwarfs, and then the same from the High Elf point of view. So there'll be a High Elf Player's Guide or an Elf Player's Guide, sorry, and a follow-up sort of GM-facing book that's more sort of location and adventure-focused. And then the same is coming for the dwarfs as well. Location guides are setting guides. There is a book on Marienburg in the works at the moment, and I'm 99% sure that that's been announced.
If you were to make a character, if I was running a game and you were to make a character for this book, what character would you roll up?
Physician. I play physician in 99% of the games that I am in. My first character when I played Warhammer fantasy roleplay for the very first time was Barber Surgeon, and since then I have defaulted to playing barber surgeons, physicians, or sawbones of some description. So yeah, I would definitely, if I had to play a character in Ubersreik or some of the Ubersreik Adventure Suite, I would definitely dust off my physician, the venerable Dr. Lindman.
So Christopher, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about Ubersreik Adventures, the third book in a series of adventures dealing in Warhammer fantasy role-playing. I hope I get to play this more because the setting is so fantastic and it just keeps calling me to go visit, and I'm hoping for the time for that. So again, Christopher, thank you so much. And
no problem at all, man. It's been a pleasure.
And to our viewers and listeners, thank you for tuning in. Stay safe out there. We'll see you next time.